The 14 greatest NBA careers wasted on bad teams. Some of these are the players' fault, a lot are the teams, but either way there's no doubt that we're about to see a lot of talent that unfortunately never got to see its full potential. The most current player whose career has been wasted on a bad team would have to be Bradley Beal. He had a good thing going early on into his career with John Wall, where they had a few playoff runs and were always in the argument for being one of the best backcourts in the NBA. But that's all they ever were. It was bad timing that Beal started to turn into a star the minute John Wall started getting injured. But it doesn't even matter because over their years together, the Wizards proved to be incapable of making any correct decisions at all. They kept Marcin Gortat as their starting center for years, let Trevor Ariza walk and sign elsewhere, signed Otto Porter to a max deal, traded Kelly Oubre the year before he stepped up for Trevor Ariza to get him back, and they traded a first-round pick for Bojan Bogdanovic, who played 26 games for them and then left in free agency. All this to say that the Wizards have been bad, and Bradley Beal's had the option to leave in the past, but it's been his choice to stay and waste his talent on a bad team instead. Tracy Mcgrady is another top-tier scorer who wasted nearly his entire career on a bad team, and it all started when he got drafted by the Toronto Raptors. In his 3 years there, Toronto didn't see his potential and the team was terrible, so he gets traded and instantly becomes an elite player and scorer. The only thing is that it was a trade to the Orlando Magic, where all superstars go to die, and he played there for 4 long seasons with very little help on the team. At one point, even though he averaged 28 points a game and led the NBA in scoring, the team was so bad they had a 21-61 record, so he immediately got traded after the season to the Houston Rockets. And don't get me wrong, those Rockets teams were really good, but T-Mac and Yao were always dealing with injuries at the worst times, so overall I think it's still reasonable to say that McGrady belongs in this video. So the Rockets didn't work, so he bounced around a few more bad teams until he just retired. Pistol Pete Maravich shared a similar story too, because even though he was an elite scorer that had an early retirement because of injuries, he never found himself on a real winning team either. And his situation was actually much worse, because in his first 3 years in the NBA, he helped the Hawks to the playoffs all 3 seasons, but that was the last time he ever made the playoffs in his career, because he would get traded to the New Orleans Jazz, and even though he led the league in scoring at one point with 31 a game, the Jazz never won more than 40 games in his 7 years on the team. And that all happened because when the Jazz traded to get him, it was their first ever year as an NBA team. So they originally brought him in to bring new excitement to the city, but when they traded 6 different draft picks to do it, it kind of backfired. DeMarcus Cousins came onto the Kings roster when he was drafted 5th overall, and the Kings, especially in recent years, have a huge reputation of not managing their team well or making the right decisions, and that's exactly what DeMarcus fell victim to, because over the 6 years that he was in Sacramento, he developed into kind of a superstar. Usually you don't get to be called a superstar if you can't bring your team wins, but I don't think this was Cousins' fault, because over his 6 seasons there, his best teammates that they got him were a young Isaiah Thomas, Rudy Gay, Rajon Rondo, and Seth Curry. And they got multiple top 10 picks for being so bad, but they ended up drafting Thomas Robinson, Ben McLemore, and Nick Stauskas, who all obviously turned out to be busts. Then of course, after finally getting a shot to be a real star and playoff contender, when getting traded to the Pelicans, he tears his Achilles 65 games in and was never the same player, ultimately ending his career as a star. Now Gilbert Arena spent his career on terrible teams, and it wasn't really for that long of a time, because he had star power but also one of the shortest primes ever thanks to injuries, starting right after he got really good. So he was drafted by the Golden State Warriors and played there for 2 seasons, and in both they were pretty bad. So instead he ended up signing with the Wizards, but Jordan had just retired there and the team was now rebuilding, so he instantly became their best player and they couldn't even manage to win 30 games. The next year they became a playoff team in 2004, and eventually, even though Gilbert made the jump to averaging 29 points a game, they still weren't able to get out of the first round, and that happened for 2 seasons before Arenas' knee injury started, and that would wind up ending his career way too early at 30 years old. So even though he became one of the best scorers in the game for 2 short years, he only made it out of the first round once ever in his career. As for Allen Iverson, I think we can still include him in this list. Of course, he had that finals run and the 76ers were playoff contenders for a few years before and after, but I think anyone would agree that those teams he was on were terrible if it wasn't for him. Sure, they had Dikembe Mutombo, but he only played 26 games. Allen Iverson led the team that year with over 31 points a game, which also led the league. Then after that, you had Theo Ratliff with 12 points a game, Dikembe with 11, and Aaron McKee with 11. And that was it. Nobody else even averaged double digits, and there wasn't anyone else with a notable name on the team. It was AI's MVP season, and only 3 other players on the entire roster played over 70 games that year. If this team was this bad in the NBA Finals, you can only imagine how bad they were every other season. And then of course, he did play with Carmelo Anthony a couple years, who was his overall best teammate, but even then they made the playoffs twice and only won 1 game. We just mentioned Carmelo Anthony, who did play with AI, and many will argue that those early Nuggets teams were pretty good, and they were, but if you'll remember, they only ever made it out of the first round once in 2008 when they made the Eastern Conference Finals. Sure, Melo was averaging 25 to 30 points a game almost every year he was in Denver, but the team had 6 total first round exits in his 7 full seasons there, winning a total of 6 playoff playoff game. So it didn't work in Denver, and things got even worse in New York when he was in the prime of his career. Listen, he was always one of the best players and top scorers in the league, but even though he had some solid teammates, it was still never enough. In his 7 years for the Knicks, he made the second round once, lost in the first round twice, and missed the playoffs completely 4 times. And then every other team he's been on afterwards hasn't had much success at all. But okay, now we're gonna shift things up to look at players who wasted their primes and their best years on bad teams, because there's 8 that I want to mention. And first is Charles Barkley. Now, personally, some of Charles Barkley's best years were on the 76ers, and at first things were great for him. He got to play with Moses Malone, Maurice Cheeks, and Julius Erving. He was set. Everything was great, but when they all started retiring, he was on his own. But as soon as that happened, he stepped up huge, averaging 28 and 12 in his first year and making the All-Star team. But over the years, no matter how good he'd play, Philly would just be a middle-of-the-road type of team, usually finishing in the 7th or 8th seed. And the most help the team ever got him was Hersey Hawkins, and that was it. So he left to the Suns, instantly won MVP, and made the finals in his first year. Then the teams he was on from there on out weren't too bad. Andre Iguodala was in a similar situation. He was never the star of his team or as good of a player as Chuck. And he did play a couple years with AI, and has played pretty much the entire second half of his career with Steph and the Warriors. So he hasn't always been on terrible teams, but in between that time came his prime as a player. Between 2006 and 2012, Philadelphia was always fighting to just make the 8th seed. And his last year in Philly was his best season when he made his only ever All-Star team. Then soon after, he joined the Warriors, and the rest is history. But Golden State got him when he was 30 and not at the very top of his game. At the rate things are going, Damian Lillard is going to wind up definitely deserving to be on this list. He's already had many years wasted in Portland while they tried to put together a rebuild that never worked. Listen, all due respect to CJ McCollum, but Dame's only ever played with one All-Star in his career, and that was LaMarcus Aldridge, and that ended in 2015. It's just sad. For a player as great as he is, since he's been in his prime, he's never had a team that's really been a threat in the playoffs. And at this rate, he never will. And you could say the same for Kevin Garnett. He won a title and Defensive Player of the Year with the Boston Celtics, but his best years were without a doubt on the Timberwolves. He played there from the time he was 19 until he was 30 years old. He won the league MVP with them and put up the best numbers of his career. But for as much talent as some of those teams had thanks to their front office decisions, they were always another team that was just bad. You have the MVP of the league, but you managed to miss the playoffs 4 times, only make the first round 7 times, and 1 conference finals. Listen, I don't think anyone can blame KG for leaving the team when he did. Kobe Bryant was on 2 great teams, with his first three-peat with Shaq, then his attempted second three-peat alongside a great team. And this one might be a stretch, but many people would argue that his best years as a player were in between that time. You look back at the 2005 and 2006 seasons, where the Lakers ended up getting eliminated in the first round. Well, in both of those years, Kobe averaged career highs and led the league with 35 and 31 points a game. Had his 81-point game, had a streak of 4 straight 50-point games, and 10 of them in total that season, became the league's top jersey seller, and made all defensive first teams in both years. Kobe was always great, but I think these couple of years he was at the top of his game when the Lakers were in between finals appearances. The same could be said for Dwayne Wade. He helped Miami win their title in 2006, and LeBron joined the team in 2010, but in the span of time between 06 and 09, D-Wade was on a different level. I mean, even going back to their 06 championship, he was like that. He had Shaq and some other veterans on the team, but he dominated that series. He put up 27 a game in the regular season and 28 a night in the playoffs, when only 2 other players were even in double digits. So it started there and continued until 09. And in that 09 season, he was fully healthy and ready to dominate, and did by winning the scoring title and averaging 37 and 5 on the year. Definitely the best personal season of D-Wade's career when the Heat were at a low point. Then finally, there's Russell Westbrook. Now look, at this rate, he almost could have belonged here for being on a bad team his whole career, but because of his OKC finals run and all of his years with Durant, I couldn't do it. Ever since then though, it's been pretty bad. Personally, he was at his best when he won MVP and averaged 31, 10, and 10, but he did it on a team where a young Victor Oladipo was their second best player, and they only won 1 game in the first round that year. I mean, as a whole, that stretch where he was averaging 20 and 30-point triple doubles from 2016 to 18 was definitely when he was at the top of his game. But actually, none of the teams he's been on after Kevin Durant left the Thunder have really been any good. Now listen, a lot of these players had some of their best years because they were on bad teams, which allowed them more opportunities to play their games and worry less about winning, but there have been some legendary players that just got stuck in bad situations. And it's up to you to decide who is who in this video. Like, comment, subscribe, and I'm out.